Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Julie Taylor, Manager of Knowledge Translation and Programs at Parachute, and I'm excited to welcome everyone to one of our Vision Zero webinar series, Cycling in Canada, Pedaling Towards Sustainable Climate Action and Vision Zero. So thanks so much for joining. We had over 130 registrants for today's workshop, so we're really excited to get started today. I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Linda Rothman, Assistant Professor, School of Occupational and Public Health with Ryerson University, now known as Toronto Metropolitan University. So Linda is going to be moderating the discussion today, and I'm going to turn it over to Linda now. Thanks, Linda.
Thanks, Julie. I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you for having me moderate the session. We're going to have some interesting conversation, and we welcome some questions and answers afterwards or within the chat, which we will be moderating. The first speaker I want to introduce is Brian Pincott, and he's based in Winnipeg. He's the Executive Director of Velo Canada Bikes. Before moving to Winnipeg in 2019, he served as a Calgary City Councillor for 10 years. During his time on the council, he was instrumental in developing pedestrian and cycling strategies. Among his many board positions over the years have been the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, Calgary Housing Company, Calgary Arts Development, NMAX, Calgary Homeless Foundation, and the Calgary Folk Festival. He is currently on the board of Functional Transit Winnipeg and Theatre by the River. He remains insatiably curious and passionately committed to building community wherever he is. Welcome, Brian.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here and join all of you from Winnipeg. Let me turn on my screen. Let me make sure that I turn on the right screen. I've seen people, and me included, turn on the wrong screen. So I'm going to start off. I'm Brian Pincott. I am the Executive Director of Velo Canada Bikes, and I go with the pronouns of he, him, and il. And I am coming to you from Winnipeg, which is the traditional territory of Treaty 1 nations and the homeland of the Métis. I just want to say that it's really important not just to say a land acknowledgement. We need to understand why we're doing it. And we are in the middle of flood season here in Manitoba. And I just learned something yesterday, which is really important for why we have to acknowledge our history, and the lands that we are on. Peguis First Nation, which is north of Winnipeg, is flooding again. And we talk about these floods of the century, but they seem to happen to Peguis First Nation every few years, and where the nation is once again underwater. And I learned that in 1907, Peguis First Nation was established by the residents of the St. Peter's Reserve, which was just north of Winnipeg, being essentially forcibly removed 160 kilometers north to where Peguis First Nation is. And they were forced off their land, which was really good farmland, onto marginal land, which as settlers and our colonial history is repeats and repeats. So it's really important to understand our history, understand that it isn't something that is just history, that it is happening to us and to the original settlers of this land from time immemorial every single day. And I think about, when I do a land acknowledgement of Treaty 1 territory, I think about Peguis First Nation, which once again is underwater because of a colonial history that forced them to be where they didn't want to be. There you go. So Velo Canada Bikes, an organization that's been around for close to 10 years, was founded to bring together cycling advocates to work at a national level around a bike-friendly Canada, specifically aimed at the federal government to get a cycling strategy, to get funding in place for cycling infrastructure right across the country. In the tagline, the elevator tagline for Velo Canada Bikes is that we want cycling for everyone, everywhere. And we work at the national level, but we have a lot of really great partners that work at the local level right across the country. And you are going to hear from one of those partners later in the next presentation. So that's who we are, and what we've been up to. So I want to talk a little bit about the state of cycling in Canada, where we're at, what is going on. And I would argue that we're at a perfect storm for opportunity in our country right now. We have had awareness over the last, I would say 20 years, 15 to 20 years, that our urban growth patterns, which is in North America, which is primarily sprawl-based, car-dependent, sprawl-based pattern, there's been a really rising awareness in the last 15 years or so that this is just not sustainable, that we have to change that pattern. And we're still doing it, so change is not easy, but at least we have that awareness, and that it has become top of mind for municipalities, large and small, right across the country. One big piece of the unsustainability of sprawl is it's financially unsustainable. Municipalities are now struggling right across the country on road networks that they just can't afford anymore. Urban growth patterns that are just completely unsustainable from a financial perspective, forget environmental and social, but just from a pure financial perspective. So that has really been hitting home lately. And I would say too, that even though we've been talking about climate change for 30 years, go back to the Kyoto Protocol, talking and arguing about it at a political level for 30 years, it's only in the last few years where we are starting to see the effects today. It isn't something that is imaginary or something that's going to happen in the future. It's happening to us today, everywhere in one way or another. That climate change in the last few years has become front and center. Everybody is talking about climate change plans and starting to get serious about emissions reductions. And then we toss a pandemic into the mix, the last piece of what I consider to be the perfect storm. And 2 years ago, 26 months ago, we had a global pandemic that hit, and municipalities across the country responded by opening up their streets, by opening up their communities for people walking, people biking all across the country. And Winnipeg was one of the leaders of doing that, of opening up streets for people, taking space away from cars and putting it in place for people. And all of those things coming together. Oh, and the thing about opening it up for people is that people really liked it. And now municipalities are trying to figure out, how do we keep that? How do we actually make that permanent? Residents are advocating for it to be permanent so that they can continue to experience their community and their neighbors in a different way, in a way that is not through the windscreen of a car going by at 50 kilometers an hour. So those are all of the things that have come together in this perfect storm to say that cycling and active transportation is ready right now. And we are seeing policies and plans and strategies all over the place. Municipalities left, right, and center are putting in active transportation policies. We now have the National Active Transportation Strategy, which was approved last year. The federal government, for the first time, now has an active transportation fund in place, $400 million over 5 years, but $400 million is in place. The federal government has just released their emissions reduction plan, which is targeting to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 45% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. We're getting climate change policies being approved at all orders of government and within the private and public sector right across the board. Internationally, of course, we've got the United Nations that is leading on climate change research and getting that across. And they've also declared now that we have this global action, this decade of global action on road safety to make sure that we decrease the carnage on our roadways. Closer to home, we've got more and more communities, and Parachute has been really instrumental in this and pushing policy and strategies around Vision Zero, which basically says we should be targeting 0 deaths on our streets, 0 deaths on our roads and streets right across, and get into terminology of roads and streets. But that all of these plans and strategies have been put in place for us to do something. And they are a really good starting point. I'll use the emissions reduction plan as an example. We have federal government has just released this emissions reduction plan, and they are completely silent on bicycles. The quintessential zero emission vehicle is ignored. So its focus when it comes to transportation remains on electrifying cars. How do we keep having cars, but electric cars? So while that might reduce car emissions, it does nothing for it does absolutely nothing for the other issues of municipal finance and that we're completely car dependent. It does nothing for traffic congestion. It does nothing for safety of pedestrians and cyclists who will get run over by those cars. And quite frankly, when you get run over by a car, if you're a pedestrian or a cyclist, it doesn't really matter whether the car has an internal combustion engine or a battery. So the focus that we are seeing so far is still on cars, on personal cars, trucks and SUVs. And the support when it comes, we can have these plans and policies and strategies in place, but the support when it comes down to the local level is incredibly inconsistent. And we are seeing the challenges right across the board of trying to get in appropriate infrastructure in place, trying to make it safe for people to be able to bike and walk to their destinations, that it can be a safe, effective choice. The support at the local level is inconsistent. The federal government can put in a plan and a strategy and some funding, but they don't actually build it in your community. And if the support isn't there, it's not going to get built. And we're still looking at everything in silos. We're still looking at how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, electrifying cars, without thinking about the larger context of municipal finances and municipal sustainability and the fact that we remain car dependent. That the urban growth patterns that we've had since the Second World War support segregation and poverty and are inequitable. So we're not connecting the dots. And a lot of it is because we have a lack of data and a lack of information that actually can connect the dots and share that with the decision makers. So we need to start changing the channel. We need to start connecting those dots. We need to change the language about how we talk about these things. We need to change the language around something as simple as how we talk about pedestrians and cyclists when they get hit. We say a pedestrian was hit by a car. We personalize the pedestrian, but we depersonalize the driver. Pedestrian wasn't hit by a car. The pedestrian was hit by a driver with their car. A cyclist was hit by a driver with their car. It's an important distinguishing, but it is one that we have to make. So we have to start changing the language. We have to make sure that we're making it safe for all and not simply safer for some. We focus our transportation networks on making it safe for cars and drivers and try and make it safer for all the other users. Our starting point should be and needs to be that it has to be safe for all. And we have to work about how we connect people, policies, and strategies. How do we actually start bringing those together so that people are front and center, not the car, not the policy, but people. How are people the center of what we're talking about? And equity. One of the things the pandemic has done is raised awareness that has brought front and center how inequitable our communities are. That those people that we have discovered we're suddenly celebrating as being our essential workers who are minimum wage jobs are socioeconomically at the bottom of the scale, and we don't think about it. And we need to build equity. We need to address it in our communities. And cycling and active transportation are an equity building tool for our communities. We need to start making sure that we are including everybody. We need to look around and see who is being left out and figure out how we get to include them. One of the projects that Velo Canada Bikes is doing is Pedal Pole Sans du Vélo. And it is about going out and looking at cyclists and counting cyclists and getting their demographic data to look at who is riding, age, gender, ethnicity, but most importantly, and more importantly, who isn't. How do we start understanding who isn't out taking advantage of active transportation and then figuring out why and doing something about it. So we have a long way to go still, but we are getting there. One last thing I want to point out in all of this, as we talk about cycling infrastructure, paint is not infrastructure. Municipalities love to throw a paint a line and say, there's your bike lane, or paint a sharrow and say, there you go. Paint is not infrastructure. It's a good way to lure people out and get them hurt. That's it from me. There's our website, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Brian. I think we're going to leave the questions until the end, if that's okay.
That sounds perfect.
Okay, great. So people write them down and keep them in your head. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the next speaker, who is Anika Riopel. She's the Sustainable Transportation Coordinator with the Ecology Action Centre, which is based out of Halifax, Nova Scotia. She holds a bachelor's degree in theatre arts and environmental sustainability from Dalhousie University and a culinary certificate from Sioux College. She also freelances as a scuba instructor at Torpedo Race Scuba Adventures with a specialization in disabled diving. Anika believes fiercely in working through partnerships to reduce barriers and make active transportation more accessible. Prior to taking on a policy role within the EAC, she coordinated the Welcoming Wheels program, which enables and empowers newcomers to access and enjoy the many benefits of cycling. Anika also conceptualized and piloted the Pop-Up Bike Hub, a mobile DIY bike space that partners with underserved communities across Nova Scotia, offer access to bicycle repair tools, parts, and educational resources. Anika believes that equity starts with building trust and aims to bring a sense of humility and humanity to policy work. Welcome.
I don't think I realized how very long that intro was, so thank you very much. Let me just get my, no, that's not what I want to be doing here. My slides set up. Hi, everyone. My name is Anika Riopel with the Ecology Action Centre in Chibuktuk, Mi'kma'ki, which is under the Peace and Friendship Treaties and is unceded territory. I'm not originally from this part of the country. I grew up in Sault Ste. Marie in Ontario, which is another lovely part of this country with a beautiful and strong Indigenous population and culture and heritage. And so that is never lost on me. And I really do appreciate Brian's land acknowledgement there about the importance of that being more than words. I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited to kind of jump off and talk more provincially context about the work that we're doing. And I think it will overlap really nicely with some of the stuff that Brian was talking about earlier, and then looking forward to having a lovely discussion. So really quick, I'm gonna jump in just right off the top. The EAC, as we like to call it, is an environmental member-based charity based out of Nova Scotia. It's been around for over 50 years. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary. And we work on a multitude of environmental issues that generally are connected via climate change, biodiversity, and environmental justice. We have 7 different teams, one that works on energy, marine, coastal, food, the built environment, and then transportation, which is the team that I'm on. I figure we're in good company. Transportation, as outlined by the National Active Strategy, is a fundamental part of how we move around communities and how we live, whether we're going to work or school or doctor's appointments or socially engaging. And the pandemic really brought that to light. The transportation team's mission is to reduce barriers to sustainable transportation. So whether that's transit, car shares, or other forms of active transportation, that's what we're here for. Broadly speaking, there are lots of very smart people who've written lots of really wonderful academic papers on, the financial benefits, the health benefits, both physically and well-being benefits. One of the pieces of study that I really love is data that's connected to some of the work we do with newcomers. That is newcomers who ride bikes and participate in cycling programs indicate a deeper sense of belonging within their community, and that there's really interesting research linking a sense of belonging to physical and mental well-being indicators. And so that sense of, as Brian was saying in his thing, of when you're in your community and moving at the speed of a bike or pedestrian, there's a deeper sense and opportunity to actually interact with people and belong in your community. So I find that really interesting, and I'm looking forward to research as that evolves. And then obviously the EAC is big fans of giving people options that reduce their carbon footprint. So Nova Scotia context, I think, is kind of an important thing before I jump into some of the policy and advocacy work that we do. We just had a provincial election and a change of government. So traditionally, or for the last decade, the East Coast has been liberal, and in this last election, it was a big upheaval, and we have a very big progressive conservative party. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think it's really interesting to look at this map, which is that Halifax metro region is the most dense part of Nova Scotia, and Sydney being the other big city out here. But what we really saw was that the rural population voted very blue, and that the big issues that were in this election were around health and health, which obviously coming out of COVID is deeply connected, but I think our medical systems across the country are struggling, and were struggling before this pandemic. And I think, new governments, partisan aside, is an opportunity for new conversations and to kind of work with new people and get some fresh ideas and perspectives. So, we certainly see this as a opportunity, but also a sense of really broadening out and a big question that we often ask ourselves is, how do we not we are a Nova Scotian NGO, we are not a Halifax NGO. And so how do we address the needs of rural folks? So we are really excited that one of the bills that the new government introduced, which was the Environmental Goals and Climate Change Reduction Act, did have to AT goals. One was to create a provincial AT strategy, which should be out next year. We'll see, fingers crossed. The other one, which is more interesting, was to complete a core active transportation network that was accessible for all ages and abilities in 65% of the province's communities by 2030, which again is like a relatively ambitious goal, depending on how you interpret it. And so we have this goal. We're excited to kind of work with this government on this, and that they at least have acknowledged that this is important. But one of the things that we're working on right now is, how do we measure that actually? And how do we get to that 65%? What is the baseline that we're currently at? How are we going to measure it? How is the government going to measure it? And then how much funding do we need to actually get there? So we've put together this resource, which is, and we're very into our teal if you haven't noticed it, 3 maps that were kind of an idea of where we are as a province right now. And then the idea was to create a monitoring tool. So we have a map for transportation plan coverages, so which areas of the province have AT plans and which ones don't, proposed infrastructure, and implementation. So again, this idea of like being able to see what we actually have planned. So those are, and then what are like shovel ready projects, or what are just theoretical ideas, and really thinking about the process that we go from a plan to proposed infrastructure to a project being completed, and looking at that from those perspectives of what is the provincial funding that needs to be dedicated to this, and what is the national funding that needs to be dedicated to this. So we have a video, and I hope you'll enjoy it. It's literally a minute long, and I hope it works.
Hi, I'm Ben Hammer from the Ecology Action Centre, here to present Nova Scotia's Active Transportation Future, a web app that presents the state of our active transportation networks at a glance in 3 maps. This map shows the coverage of existing active transportation plans, plans in development, and communities that still need plans. This map shows the networks proposed in existing active transportation plans and how they connect across the province. This map shows the progress we've made in making these networks a reality. Nova Scotia has committed to building active transportation networks in 65% of communities by 2030. This tool will support coordinating and monitoring achieving this goal and building Nova Scotia's active transportation future. Get on board for a really good time.
So big shout out. This map was very much the brilliant idea of my colleague, Ben Hammer, who is a GIS superstar. So far the map has been very well received. We're sharing it with elected officials, but we're also sharing it with folks in departments and at multi-level of the government. One of the things that we find often are barriers is that oftentimes getting these infrastructure things through, you need municipal buy-in, you need provincial buy-in, but also you need provincial and municipal buy-in across departments. And so there's so many people who have to come together, and if you have the right person, things can move really quickly. And if you have people who are putting their feet in, things can move a lot slower. So really what we're hoping with this map is that we're creating a monitoring tool that allows everyone to kind of get on the page really quickly. And then there's an accountability piece there as well. The other piece that the EAC does around advocacy and policy is we have a website called the Active Alliance, Atlantic Active Alliance, which is predominantly a resource space that we've put together for anyone who works in any level of government for tools. So one of the things that we recognize in Nova Scotia is we have a lot of rural communities, and oftentimes those communities won't have someone who's dedicated to be like an AT person or a policy person, but rather they're actually managing active transportation and the music festivals and the community's social media. And so they're split, and their job criteria is so sometimes you have people who really are interested and excited. And so our idea with this is putting together these toolkits to help people, and then help them find funding, help them find best practices, and all of those things. And also myth busting is a big one. So a big resource page that our goal is to support communities with moving forward. Now, I'm really quick on my time here, so I'm just going to rapid fire run through some of our programs that I'm generally really excited about, which is the other piece of the work we do. We do policy, but really the vast majority of the work we do is through programming and partnerships and reducing barriers. And so this work has been something that we have been working on for over the last 20 years, and it has evolved and changed as things change and as the community's needs change, but also as we see and learn about different barriers. As Brian indicated, I think we're constantly in a place of humility of learning about things that we just didn't know about. And so the idea of always doing better, of always listening, and of always reaching out. And so originally, approximately 20 years ago, we started with a program called Making Tracks, and the goal was to get safe cycling education for youth into schools and rec centers. And so we've trained, we have a train the trainer model, so we would train leaders, and then those leaders would be out in school. So we are still running this program, but the idea with most programs that we run is how can we work ourselves out of a job? So at some point we look to hand these off and have this education be adopted by the school board. One of the interesting things as things evolved, we've seen a huge demand in urban cycling for adults, adults who have the skills to ride but are nervous about riding in cities are really keen. So one of the evolutions was that we created this program in partnership with the Halifax Cycling Coalition and with Bicycle Nova Scotia and some other folks across the province. When the pandemic hit, we created these online safe cycling videos, which are really fun and short videos that are available in English, French, Arabic, and Mi'kmaq. And hopefully we'll be adding some more languages to that as we go. But again, kind of getting these little snapshots out to get that information out far and wide. Welcoming Wheels, which was the program that I coordinated for 4.5 years, started in response to the influx of Syrian refugees into Nova Scotia. And the idea originally was to fix up donated bikes and get them into newcomers' hands. The program really quickly expanded to a much broader group. We work in partnership with our immigrant services, with refugee clinics, with international centers, with the YMCA, so big, strong networks. And then the program has also evolved over the years of learning what's working. So one of the big things was we used to get a lot of kids. We're still doing lots of kid giveaways, but that we had a lot of adults who wanted and needed a lot more kind of one-on-one support. So we're working on the Bike Buddy project, which is also a project that is being run with Vancouver and Toronto in tandem with Simon Fraser University. And basically the idea is that we pair a local with a newcomer and they go on a bike ride for 1 to 2 hours a week for 3 months. And we're just seeing really wonderful take-ups in this program, but also this idea of it's more than bikes. It's about building community and connection and a sense of belonging. And so there's really wonderful things that are kind of coming out of this program anecdotally, as well as the broader research that we're participating with Toronto and Vancouver on these projects. We have an Earn a Bike program where we're teaching folks how to work on their own, teaching folks how to fix their own bike. So again, that capacity building and skill sharing. We definitely have lots of newcomers who have mechanical skills and are super keen, but just getting access to tools and parts is a big barrier. So we're trying to reduce those barriers. I feel like I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to be real quick. Our other project that I'm really excited about is the Pop-Up Bike Hub. This project came out of the recognition that the majority of the bike shops in Halifax were on the peninsula, which is this part that's not in red. But the majority of the clients through our programs were kind of in this red area. So you can kind of see it. It's not a great, perfect map, but that we were giving bikes away and then people didn't know how to fix them. And it was simple things like a flat tire was like, the bike is broken. And so we came up with this idea of a mobile repair space that we could move. It was supposed to pilot in 2020. Obviously things went sideways. But one of the interesting things that came out of that was that we realized this wasn't an HRM problem. This was a Halifax or a Nova Scotia problem. And we ended up partnering with communities across Nova Scotia and we fixed up bikes. The first year we fixed up just under 300. The second year we fixed up over 900 bikes. And those were really simple repairs. So again, this idea of constantly evolving our programming to meet the needs, but also we had partners reaching out to us and asking for what they needed in their communities. So building things in partnership was a big part of our thing. I'm just gonna rip through these. I love talking about growing and deepening impact. I love talking about the other things that happen around this, building community, food, and then also this question too of like expanding the equity of who's missing and what are those barriers that they need to participate. This is my wonderful team, who are the best. And my email's right in there, and then I will throw links to some of the stuff that I referenced in the chat as soon as I'm done.
Great, thank you, Anika. That's wonderful. There's been a bit of conversation in the chat that I see regarding community surveys, and people have been great about sharing some information on here. Also, some research links have been put up. And particularly around barriers, which both of you talked about, and enablers of cycling. I've got questions, but I'm not going to ask them yet. I'm wondering if anybody in the audience has questions. You can put them into the chat, or you're more than welcome. And I always encourage people to speak because it's nice to hear people's voices. So any questions for either of the speakers? There's a bit of conversation about pedal pole going on. Any questions?
I will make an observation. A key word that keeps happening when we talk about cycling and all of that, the word that is predominant is community, 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 community. And Anika's was all about, was less about cycling to me and more about community and community building. So that's just an observation that I recognize that Environmental Action Centre does that in Halifax, but I know that's happening right across the country, and it's pretty amazing.
It's interesting because it's not, I'm a cyclist in downtown Toronto, and I don't think about my cycling as being a community driven. Just because I'm in such a large urban core. So it's actually interesting for me to listen to that aspect of cycling and the cycling community. I don't really have that. I feel like I'm going to die every time I get on my bike, but I'm willing to risk it to get downtown. There's one question: how do we see the programs continue to evolve into the future?
Yeah, I was really trying to speak as fast as humanly possible there. I think we've seen things change so much in the last 2 years of, again, continuing to evolve and respond and follow the voices of the people we're partnering with. The pop-up bike hub has been a huge undertaking, but one of the things we're realizing is that there's a lot of interest in communities to build that capacity in the communities themselves. So we're looking at different ways of creating workshops where we can start, we can leave toolkits, but also that we can leave kind of the foundation of like basic bike 101 aspects. Other things too is that I often think of like the best thing that can happen is when we see people become champions within their own communities. So again, we have a lot of newcomers. They come from totally different backgrounds. And sometimes we build, again, this relationship, this sense of community with someone, and they continue to come back in and volunteer with our programs well beyond when they were the program that they were engaged with. When we see that, I love to call that like little community champions that are going out and starting their own work, and that snowball effect of the work that we do, because that's the real power.
Great, thank you. There is somebody named SB who has their hand up. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question? SB with a hand up. Okay, we can come back.
Just going to say, Mark had a quick question in the Q&A about pedal pole and how it's different than eco counters. Eco counters are counting bikes. They're agnostic as to who was on the bike. Pedal pole is less about counting the bike and more about counting the cyclists. We're interested in who is riding the bike, so we can start building that qualitative data. And as I said in my presentation, to see who's there, but mostly who isn't there. And we have a lot of anecdata that it is predominantly males that are out riding, and pedal pole is starting to show that. So it's about trying to capture qualitative data as to the cyclist, as opposed to just counting the number of bikes that we're having.
I have a question from Danielle. In rural areas, I've observed conflict between motorized recreational vehicles, ATV and snowmobiles, and active transportation, and find resistance with accepting active transportation as it is seen as preventing these other motorized recreation. Do you have any data on the mixing of these forms on trails or pathways to help with advocacy? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, and it depends. It depends where. Some places are more, some provinces are and groups are more active in, for lack of a better term, policing that. I think that the underlying factor is that there's just not enough of it. Everybody is trying, too many, we're all trying to use it, whether we're on an ATV, a snowmobile, or a bike or an e-bike or out for a hike. You'll see there are trails associations and trails groups all across the country who are working on getting more and being a lot clearer on the delineation. I would argue Quebec is probably doing the best in that area with the extensive route verte in Quebec. And Nova Scotia, with Bicycle Nova Scotia doing the blue route, they're doing really good work there as well. But it is, when I see conflict, whether it's on trails like that, or whether it's in an urban setting, the root of it is often that there's just not enough infrastructure. We're forcing all the different users to try and use the same thing. And so the solution is to support more.
Thanks, Brian. There's a couple of just comments. Anika, did you have something else you wanted?
Yeah, I could throw that out. I mean, like, I grew up in a relatively, small is perhaps not the right word, but I would say rural community. And also, like, that's definitely a thing that we see a lot of in Nova Scotia, of that conflict between motorized and non-motorized vehicles. And I think, yeah, Brian's point of being like, there's different ways of enjoying nature, and polarizing is often kind of the worst way we can go to having productive conversations. But that idea of, like, we can have infrastructure that keeps everyone safe, but also a shared understanding of those road rules and respect on the road. So I think sometimes too, I when talking to people in an urban context and they complain about bikes, and then pointing out that and being like, the more bikes there are on the road, the less congestion there is. It actually is a win for you as a driver. And so, like, trying to reframe some of those conversations, I think is a really important thing. But again, anecdotally, we had someone who participated in our Bike Buddy program, and afterwards in her exit survey, she said, when I used to drive, whenever I would see bikes on the road, I was always really mad because I was like, get out of here, you're in my space. But now I see them and I'm like, they're like me. And I give them lots of space, which part of me was like, that's terrifying that that's how you used to drive your car. But also, big win that by just getting someone out riding a bike changes how they perceive cyclists and other road users when operating a vehicle. So small wins.
What I found interesting in Toronto is I'm a scientist. I do research on cycling and pedestrian collisions, and we have a lot of issues around counting. We don't know what the proportion of people who are getting hurt because we have no denominator data, we call it. We don't know how many people are actually out riding. And I know pedal pull, I'm not sure how representative it is of the bigger context. So we have a lot of problems counting rates of injuries. But what I do want to say is recently we did some research looking at hospitalizations and emergency room visits. And the vast majority of cycling collisions are actually not happening on the roads. They're being put into hospital or ED visits on these, I guess, multi-use trails and recreational riding. So the whole concept of being able to mix, not necessarily just motor vehicles, but pedestrians and cyclists and other cyclists together, and the vast numbers that we saw increased over COVID in Toronto is a huge thing that we need to be looking at. We need more trails, we need separation, we need something. I'm not sure what it is. We've been good about starting to put some more cycle tracks in Toronto, but we now also have to deal with the off-road riding that's going on in the cities, which, I had no idea how bad that was actually. So that was just a comment in terms of data, because we're always looking for new data in my work. There's a question from Peter. The BC Cycling Coalition is looking at creating an inventory of safe infrastructure for vulnerable road users. Does anyone have a methodology for defining and tracking safe infrastructure routes? I have an answer for that, but it looks like Brian does too.
Well, I was going to say, I think that, well, you take a look at what what EAC is, Ecology, I almost called you the Environmental Action Center, the Ecology Action Center. I used to volunteer with the EAC back in the 90s. Anyway, that's what they're starting to do, is pulling that together. I think one of our challenges, and we're seeing work that's coming out of Simon Fraser on this, is defining what's safe, right? 10 years ago, we used to think that, oh, well, we're going to accommodate cyclists by painting a bike lane and putting a sharrow in. Well, there's nothing safe about that. Mm-hmm. So we need to start redefining and defining what is safe, and go from there. Linda.
There's a comment that the number of cyclists have increased dramatically in the Nordics once they established physically separated lanes with narrow products suitable for urban environments. And some of these can be removed also during heavy snow seasons for easier snow plowing. So the whole issue of safety, but also being, in our climate, we need to be able to clear the paths as well, is really a point well taken. I do know Simon Fraser, they have a group there who are looking at infrastructure. Megan Winters, that group, we work really closely with her, actually on a new grant we're putting together right now on all ages and ability cycle tracks. So they do some stuff on safety and infrastructure as well.
Kara just threw that link up in the chat. Thank you, Kara.
That's great.
Hi, Kara. I would also throw out there too, I think infrastructure is something we talk about a lot, but I also really do believe that infrastructure and programming have to operate together, that if you don't do them, if you don't educate people on how to use new routes and remove those barriers, you're going to have problems, but also educating other road users on what the rules are. So that idea of partnership is super important, but also from an equity perspective, that if we're just building infrastructure and we're not making sure that we're providing programs that are also supporting it so that everyone can actually access the infrastructure, then we're also not doing communities a service. So one of the things that we see a lot of here is that low socioeconomic families, newcomer communities tend to live in really small apartments, and their apartment buildings don't have bike storage, which means their bikes are being left outside over winter, which means that they're the season. So bike storage, which doesn't feel like a important infrastructure piece, is a huge barrier for a lot of folks, particularly if you live through a winter.
Yeah, I would agree completely. We need to expand what we think of as infrastructure, that it isn't just the bike lane. It is, where are you going to lock your bike up at your destination? If you don't have a place to lock your bike up safely at your destination, there isn't a bike rack, you're not going to ride your bike there. So the bike lane, who cares? We have to start looking at land use bylaws to make sure that we're doing things like including bike storage and change facilities in office settings and in residential settings, repair shops. All of those kinds of things are cycling infrastructure that we need just as much as a bike lane. So if trying to get millions of dollars to get a new separated cycle track in seems daunting, start with getting in some bike racks. They count, and we need those just as much as we need the bike lane.
There's lots of chat going on. In a city with just a few multi-use paths, wouldn't the creation of bike lanes, I guess, Brian, you can, this is directed towards something you said, with paint and signage be a good start towards building a cycling infrastructure? I'm not feeling paint is not infrastructure.
Yeah. I think if you look at the safety data around paint, it doesn't do much. If you look at the research that around comfort, and a lot of times the barrier for somebody to ride in an urban center, in an urban setting, is comfort and perceptions of safety, and paint does nothing for that. No, paint should not be considered to be, paint by itself should not be considered to be an intervention that will get more people cycling. It just won't. If you combine it with shifting of parking so that you use a parked lane of cars as a protective barrier for a painted bike lane, that is a step better than just paint. But I think the data and the research around comfort and safety show that paint just doesn't do it.
And something else that you said, and I think it's Stefan mentioned, that safety should mean both actual and perceived safety for all ages, 80 to 80. And there's been some research done at UBC there. So it's not just the actual, which is important, it's the perceived in terms of increasing cycling.
Yep.
We have 1 more minute. I'm going to just grab one of these other comments. This is interesting from Peter. How about expanding outside the quotation active transportation, human powered only silo to vulnerable road users, which would include micromobility devices, electric assisted, electric powered by the disabled, and many others. They're using Halifax multi-use trails, sidewalks, paint, and separated bike lanes. So there's a big.
Yeah, I think this is like a great question. And I think it's also like this point of the evolution of the language we use as we evolve our concepts. I mean, active transportation was like an evolutionary word not that long ago. And now we're really seeing that it is limited and should be more inclusive. And so I would agree that changing that perception of who we include, and certainly when I think about it, I'm including that bigger picture, but yeah, the language is not there. But also, you know, policies and strategies move slowly, particularly when you're moving through multi-layers of government, that sometimes the language is outdated by the time you actually get the rubber stamp on something. So yeah.
I would agree completely, Anika. I think that when people talk about active transportation, there is an implicit understanding that it does include e-bikes and e-scooters and scooters and a whole bunch of wheeled vehicles. Is that the right way to call it? I don't know. You raise, we're at a point now, the evolution of e-bikes, the evolution of of battery powered mobility is such that we're going to reach a tipping point where this trying to look at, say, the road right of way, and how do we carve out a little bit more room for cyclists, and how do we carve out a little bit more room for this and this, is not going to get us much further. We're going to have to step back, look at the entire road right of way, building face to building face in an urban setting, and say, how do we actually look at this, that we're including everybody, as opposed to looking at it as a car zone that we're trying to carve out space for different users.
I know Julie wants to tie up, but I just do want to say there's some great comments in the chat, and I'm assuming Julie's got them somewhere, and also some great links that I'm hoping that people can access after the talk. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you so much to our panelists, Anika and Brian, and to our moderator, Linda, for a fantastic webinar. Thanks to all the participants for attending and for all the great questions and discussion that we had in the chat as well. And yeah, there's some great links to resources and research and information. So we did record this session, and we will be sending it out to all webinar registrants after the webinar within the next couple of days. It'll also be available on our website, and I'll be sure to include some of these links and resources in our follow-up communication. And as I mentioned in the beginning, this webinar is part of our Vision Zero webinar series. We have another 5 or so webinars coming up over the next several months, so stay tuned. We do have our next one happening on May 31st on the topic of children and active transportation. And that's taking place during our Safe Kids Week, which is running May 30th to June 5th, focused on safe and active transportation. So stay tuned for more details on that webinar and how to register. And if you could take, we do have a short evaluation that I don't know, Michael, if you can pop that up on the screen. If not, I can include that in our follow-up communication that we'll send out to everybody with the webinar recording. So it looks like, yeah, it looks like we'll be sending that that link in our follow-up. But thanks again, everyone, so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.